any advice for like when you say this bass is already set, but then they use a lot of different tunings, like open, drop A, drop D.
If you're doing drop tuning a lot, you're going to need to add a little bit more relief into your neck, because as soon as you release some of the tension, the neck is going to straighten out. And so if you're doing a drop A, where I showed you how to get the perfect action in this part of the neck, add another quarter turn of truss rod relief, and that should be enough so that the neck doesn't straighten out too much on it. Pickup height. So every pickup is like an antenna for noise, and that's something that you can't really control. You can make hum-canceling pickups, but they're still going to attract noise. The closer the pickup gets to the string, the louder the output of the pickup, and so you can kind of control your signal to noise ratio just by having the pickup a little closer to the strings. So you can make a noisy bass slightly less noisy by raising your pickups. Now, if you raise them too high, you're going to start rubbing the string on top of the pickup. And if you look at this one here, you can see that this one's had some hard play on it, and the plastic is starting to get banged up by the strings. That's not such a big deal if the pickups are covered. If open pole pieces, though, what can happen is you can two things can happen. If the pole pieces are not grounded, every time you touch them, you're going to get a buzz. And if they are grounded, sometimes you'll just hear this thud as the string hits the pole piece. So the perfect height, again, is depending on how hard you play. But what I like to do is I like to start with about 1/8 of an inch, or 3 millimeters. So fret at the very last fret, and look for about a 3 millimeter gap over top of the pickups. And then on this side, about double that. So 3 to 6 millimeters, double's a little bit much. 3 to 5 millimeters. And then, how does it sound? So when you plug into an amp, is the output roughly the same? If, let's say, the E string is quieter than the G string, then raise the pickup a little bit and that'll make it louder. If it's too loud, you can drop it down a little bit and try and balance the G, the two outside strings, the G to the E or the G to the D on a 5 string. Once you get the pickup height set, the last thing you should check is if they're too high, you'll hear some dissonance as you play in the upper frets. And what's happening is that magnetic field is grabbing onto the string, and it's resisting its movement only in this area. So the string wants to vibrate freely, but it's being held by magnets over top of the pickups. So if you start to hear this, it's almost like a steel drum tone. If you start to hear that, try lowering your strings, or sorry, lowering the pickups, and see if you can release some of that magnetic pull in the string and clean that up a little bit. And that is, again, that depends on how you play. If you play a lot in the upper frets, that's way more important. If you don't play up there at all, you can still have your strings up, and they can be grabbing onto the magnetic field can be grabbing onto the string all you want, but you won't notice it if you're not playing up in the upper frets. Intonation. Intonation is this adjustment here. You're moving the saddle backwards and forwards. So what's going on is, just like the nut, when you're pressing the string down, you're stretching it. When you stretch the string, it raises the pitch. And so you have this adjustment here, which allows you to pull the saddle back a little bit, which actually flattens the string. Flattens the string theoretically, but as you're stretching the string down, you're stretching it back up to pitch. And so even though the saddle is theoretically too far away, by the time you get the string down to the fret, it's pulled it back up into pitch. The higher the action is, the more the string is being stretched sharp, and so the further back that saddle has to be. The thicker the string, the more reactive it is to stretching, and so the further back the saddle has to be. The saddle is always going to go away from the theoretical center. If you find that put a fresh set of strings on and you have to move your saddle forward, chances are you've got a bad string. EQ, this is a passive bass, but when you have an active bass, you've got all kinds of tone shaping available at your fingertips. Now, I've heard some pretty high-end professional players say that they do this to their controls. They turn them all up to 10 because they want every tone out of the bass that they can get. Unfortunately, if you've ever looked at an EQ curve, what you're getting is you're getting a bump in the lows, a bump in the mids, and a bump in the trebles. You're not getting all the frequencies. You're actually, because you have to turn down your volume now because you've boosted all these frequencies, you're actually losing those frequencies in between. So to get the most tone out of your bass, set it flat, and then you're getting as even a response as possible, which is all the frequencies. And then adjust it to taste. Some onboard EQs have like crazy amounts of boost. You can get up to 18 dB of boost in some of these controls, and that's just madness. That's the thinking behind that is when you're plugged in your living room, it sounds gorgeous. Problem is when you go to play live, you can't hear yourself because you've got all this boost on the bass and treble and no mid-range. And so we always recommend set your EQ as flat as possible on the amp, and then adjust for the room. If you need a little more bass, then adjust it. But don't just crank up the bass because it sounds better. Once the band kicks in, you're going to be in trouble. Speaking of that, mid-range. So our ears are wired mainly for human speech. That's what the brain is listening for most of the time. We have to understand each other. And virtually everybody's voice is in the mid-range. And so that's where our ear is most sensitive. That's what our brain is best at understanding. And so even though it's a bass, the mid-range is very important. And so even though it sometimes sounds prettier to have a scoop mid-tone, and it sounds great for slap, when you're setting your EQ, try and dial in some mids and get used to the sound of mids in your bass because you'll cut through better that way. Getting close to the end of a setup, one of the questions we get a lot is, how do I clean my instrument? So it really depends on what kind of finish you have on it. Shiny finishes are always sprayed, and so guitar polish. Don't use furniture polish. Lemon Fresh Pledge is great for your dining room table, but it can leave deposits all over your finish that can get into the fingerboard and make it hard for the next set of frets to hold into the wood. It makes refinishing a nightmare. But guitar polishes have been designed for guitar finishes, so they don't have silicones in them. They clean your guitar, but they don't leave a deposit on them. As far as rosewood fingerboards and ebony fingerboards, lemon oil, you can buy, I would use the stuff that you buy at music stores. Again, it's a clean product, it doesn't leave deposits in the wood. There really isn't anything you can do to stop, let's say, the neck from shrinking and the frets from sticking out. That's a humidity issue. Oil isn't going to help that. Oil will not keep your fingerboard from cracking. The only thing you can do to keep your fingerboard from cracking is just not let it dry out, and that's a humidity issue. Saskatchewan is notorious for having super dry winters and a cracked acoustic top and a cracked ebony fingerboard. That's kind of life in Saskatchewan. There's not much you can do to prevent that. Lastly, if you go on the internet and you do any searches on tones of wood, you have two groups of people. There are the people that think wood makes an incredible difference in tone, and then there are the people that think wood makes absolutely no difference in tone. And some of these guys over in this camp are actual builders, which blows me away that they can build guitars and not think that the wood affects the tone. But they do have a point. If you're in the audience of let's say 2,000 seat arena, you're not going to be able to hear the difference between a rosewood fingerboard and maple fingerboard. You're just not going to be able to hear it. You won't be able to hear the difference between alder and swamp ash or mahogany. But that's not really the point. The point is the player is going to be able to feel the difference. So woods affect tone, but they affect response. They affect how the bass responds to your touch. And so, have you ever played an instrument that just felt like no matter how hard you played, it felt like it was just sucking tone away from you? It was just fighting you? And then there are some basses where you pick them up and you play them and they just seem to they almost the notes are playing themselves. And so, that's all wood combination. And the best wood for you, Jesse, might be not the best wood for you, Kalen. Kalen, I think you like a heavier bass. Yeah. Jesse, you like a heavier bass, lighter bass?
Just for my back, I like the lighter bass.
Okay.
Yeah.
Have you noticed any difference in response?
Yeah, I've kind of noticed that the heavier bass kind of has maybe a little bit more darker sort of thing. It might sustain a little bit more.
Sustains more, maybe more compressed.
Yeah.
And you like that for what reason?
I just like how the way it resonates and
Yeah.
the tunes that I play in and just how it affects everything. Like I generally play drop tunings and you just fill it out a little more.
Tighter, the bass is more controlled.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely get it for sure. Like you can definitely hear it, I think.
And you would play what kind of music mostly?
I like to play a lot of R&B and stuff. I play a lot of country around here and stuff. Just when you're on a ship, you play a lot of basically anything.
And you play mainly?
Metal.
Yeah, so
Hard rock.
there's a, especially with R&B, a lot of sustain isn't a good thing.
Yeah.
You actually want an instrument to have a little bit faster decay. With metal, I think you probably want as much sustain as you can get, is that right?
Yeah, and then there's a distortion on top of it just to add to it.
Yeah, so wood doesn't generate tone, wood damps tone. And I like to think about cars when I'm thinking about wood. A car suspension system has a set of springs, and if you just have the springs and you're running down the road and you hit a bump, the spring is going to do this. Now that's called, in the case of wood, that's resonance. Now wood also damps. In other words, it sucks vibration away from the string. And so in a car they have shock absorbers which limit the spring. So you hit a bump and you have a shock absorber in your car, and instead of the spring doing this, it does that. And so the shock absorber clamps down on that resonance of the spring and keeps it from vibrating. So in terms of wood, you have areas where the wood wants to resonate, and then you have areas where the wood wants to damp. And generally there are two. Where's that other truss rod? Okay, so the EQ curves on wood are not radical. So in the case of some woods, you have a slightly depressed mid, and you have a little bit of resonance in the top and the bottom. And then you have other woods where it's the opposite. You have resonance in the mids, but it kind of rolls off on the top and the bottom. So how do you tell the difference? In the case of swamp ash, you can actually see the grain. You can see these heavy grains going through the wood, and then there'd be a space and another heavy grain. That's called ring porous, and what that is those heavy grains kind of reinforce the bottom end, and then the alternate layers of the harder woods reinforce the top, and then there's nothing really in the middle that reinforces the middle. So with a swamp ash curve like that, I like to go with, let's say, a maple neck with a maple fingerboard, which has a response like this, and that fills in the mids. And so you have a body that has lots of reinforcement in the top and the bottom, and then the neck has reinforcement in the middle, and you get a nice even tone response. You can get into a little bit of trouble. I'll use this truss rod. You get into a little trouble if you try and match two woods that have similar characteristics. Like if you have a neck with a relatively scooped tone and a body with a relatively scooped tone, if they're not lined up, you can wind up with some really weird sort of cutouts. And so that's why we like to have sort of this opposite tonality in the neck and the body. Mahogany, An alder are like this, swamp ash is like this. Wenge, in terms of the neck, has more of a scoop tone. Maple has more of a mid-centric tone. So I really like to match Wenge with either mahogany or alder, and then maple with swamp ash. Those are just classic combinations. Any questions on strings, truss rod, nut? Pickup height?
I have a question on how much does the mass of wood that you're using affect what you were talking about?
That's really interesting. Not only does mass affect the tone, but the surface area of the body and then the thickness of the body all affect as well. So the cool thing about this particular body is it's got a lot of surface area, and so it's almost like a satellite dish. It's receiving all this air pressure from speakers, and that's moving the body. If it was a little tiny Steinberger body, the air would hardly affect it at all. But because this is big and relatively thin, this will really react to sound pressure. Now, as far as the mass goes, the heavier the body, the more it's going to resist damping the strings. So the strings, you're going to have more vibration from the string, longer sustain, but you're also going to have less of a woody tone. And when you're playing it, it's going to be compressed, and it's not going to have that. It's going to be more of a melodic instrument than a rhythmic instrument. And so a lighter, less dense wood is going to absorb more of that vibration, and it'll sound more rhythmic, and it'll be greater for, it'll be a better wood for, let's say, funk style playing, slap and pop. Well, it depends. 70s slap and pop is more of a heavier body tone. Slap and pop on a 60s instrument would be more faster decay. I don't know if that's answering your question for you.
That's cool.
Any more questions on set? Yes.
Yeah, what causes, is like one guitar or, one bass and like, to be just more temperamental, like it just moves a little bit more like the truss rod?
That's a really good question. So, if you look at this neck, we've got a really thin piece of exotic wood glued to a really thick piece of domestic wood. They didn't grow up on the same part of the planet, let alone we didn't put like at least equal amounts of each wood together. If this was a cabinet maker making this, he would have used like the same thickness of fingerboard and the same thickness of neck. So we've got two woods that don't get along. Secondly, the fingerboard's been finished with oil, and the back of the neck's been finished with polyurethane. So now you've created an imbalanced structure in terms of two woods, and then you finish them with an imbalanced finish. And so moisture vapor is going to get into that fingerboard much faster than the back of the neck, which means it's going to swell it and it's going to tip it back. Then when it dries out, the moisture leaves the fingerboard first. It takes a longer time to get out of the back of the neck. And so that's a fact of life with rosewood and ebony fingerboards. Ebony is much more reactive than rosewood. Palo ferro is much less reactive than rosewood. A maple neck is going to be the most stable, but still, that maple neck has a bunch of slots in it, and moisture can get in under the fret and into that end grain really quickly. And so even a maple neck is not as stable as it could be. But there's one other thing too, and that is the old style of truss rod used in, well, I won't mention brands, but old style truss rods. It's a single bar of metal, and as you tighten it, it clamps against the wood. And one thing about wood is that when it heats up, it actually shrinks. Whereas metal, when it heats up, it expands. So wood and metal do the exact opposite things when they warm up or cool down. When wood cools down, it actually grows. And when metal cools down, it shrinks. So if you've got a truss rod that's clamping that wood, and let's say you're on an outdoor stage and it's a cloudy day, have you ever noticed when the sun comes out, all of a sudden your guitar goes out of tune? That's because the neck is starting to warm up and the wood is shrinking, the metal's expanding. So with this style of truss rod, because it's independent of the wood, it will be much more stable. Like Fury guitars are known for being really stable, even on outdoor stages. That's one of the reasons why we use